Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, I've got a new amplifier to show you. Now for those of you who've been paying attention, I have used this amp a couple of times recently in demo videos, so you might have already spotted this thing. But I wanted to tell you all about it today because it's not as it first appears. So this amp started life as a Morris Perplex'd Jr 30. Now, Glenn Morris is an amp builder in Ontario in Canada, and he has a real reputation in the world of boutique amps for putting out some of the finest Marshall style amps you can get. And for a while now, I've been on the lookout for a Marshally type amp that will give me a little bit more gain than I'm used to. Because my favourite amp I've ever played is my JCM 45 clone. But with the channels jumped and both of them dimed, it will do heavier gain, but it's not in its happy place. It's really kind of excitable in the low end, and the whole amp just sounds like it's about to explode. It's a wonderful sound, but it's very much its own thing. It's not that kind of JMP Marshall sound that's much more designed for heavier gain. It's a much more sort of refined Marshally gainy sound. So I spotted this on eBay and it seemed to kind of tick those boxes. So I bought it a few months ago from a chap in Chessington on the outskirts of London. And I got it back here, and it's a very interesting amp on paper because it's 30 watt, class A, cathode-biased, tube-rectified with no negative feedback. So it's a kind of amalgamation of Vox and Marshall, because 30 watt class A cathode bias no negative feedback is very AC30ish, but it's EL34 with a much more kind of barky mid-range, which is more overtly Marshall. So it was an interesting combination of those two worlds of amplifier. So I was getting to know it, and there was a couple of things about it that, don't get me wrong, it was a wonderful sounding amp, but it wasn't quite as I was expecting. The first was it didn't really have too much of that kind of trademark upper mid-range Marshall cut and sizzle. It sounded fantastic, but it was a little bit lacking in that area. But more than that, it had so much low end in it, it was unbelievable. Now, the JCM 45 is obviously based on the Fender Bassman, a bass amp. So when you're dialing it in for 6-string guitar, you tend to turn the bass knob off, or one at most. With that bass knob off, and this bass knob off, this was so much thicker. And with anything other than a Strat bridge pickup, the low end was so dominant I just could not dial it out. The only way I was able to tame it was using a vintage 30 speaker that really tightens up the low end. Into anything else, that low end was just so prominent. Now, in the background, I was emailing Glenn Morris asking about what circuit this amp was based on and the philosophy behind it and its specifications, all that sort of stuff. And he said to me that this amp has an output transformer in it that would allow it to be run at 45 watt class AB fixed bias, much more similar to a classic Plexi. So I asked him what the tonal changes would be, and he said it would have more kind of bite in the upper mid-range and a tighter low end, the two things I was craving. So I said, how difficult would it be to make the changes? And he said, well, if you know a competent amp tech, it should be fairly easy. So I sent him a gut shot of this amplifier in its stock form, and what he sent me back was just fantastic. It was the gut shot annotated in Microsoft Paint with all the changes that would need to be made to turn this into basically a 50 watt Plexi. So I sent it to my amp tech here in Bristol, a great chap called Mike Devine. He runs Amp Loft. He's been looking after my amps for years. And I basically said, does this make any sort of sense to you? And he looked at it and said, yeah, it seems to. It was adding a choke. It was adding a bias, so it wasn't cathode biased anymore. It was changing some resistor and capacitor values, all of that. And I gave him the amp, and a couple of months later, I picked it up, and it's now basically a modded 50 watt Plexi. And he said that the picture that Glenn sent me, yes, it looked a bit cartoonish, but everything on there was absolutely dead on. So Glenn clearly doesn't have his schematics kind of formally mapped out, but he knows those circuits so well, and he knew exactly what needed to be done to turn this amp into something that I was going to absolutely love. So I've been getting to know it in the last few weeks, and the real key to this amp is the gain switch. It has two different positions, 1 and 2. Now in the first mode, it's a kind of warmer, very classic sort of JMP Plexi type thing. But in the second gain mode, it doesn't just up the gain. Glenn said that it tightens up the low end and really kind of hoofs the upper mid-range. So it gives you a bit more of that kind of sizzly, sort of appetite for destruction, Arredondo modded, kind of very hot brown sound Marshall type thing. So it has these two characters to it, vintage warm Plexi and modded angry Plexi. So what I'm going to do today, folks, is just put a variety of different guitars into this amplifier to show you what tones I can coax out of it. I'm not going to use any pedals today. I'm just going to go straight into the front end and reel out the classic rock. Now, my main cabinet that I tend to use for all of my demos and recordings is my Alnico cabinet. It's got a Celestian Gold and a Fane A30 in it. But of course, the kind of heavier gain Marshall thing is much more closely associated with the Celestian Greenback, the G12M. So I'm going to use two different cabinets today. The first is my standard Alnico cabinet, but the second has a Celestian Heritage G12M reissue in it and a Warehouse Invader 50, which is a kind of higher rated greenback type thing. And I'm going to use this amp into both of those cabinets to show you the kind of clanky, vintage, scoopy Alnico thing, but the very mid-dominant, kind of tight low end AC/DC classic rock thing. And I don't think my playing is going to be overly inspired today because this thing just screams classic rock. So I'm going to reel out all the dad rock licks that I know. So without further ado, folks, here we go. So there we are, folks. Now please do comment underneath, let me know what you thought of this amp today in its modified form. I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks down in the comments section. Now this thing just breathes classic Marshall tone, doesn't it? And I think today it sounded equally at home into both the Alnico and greenback cabinets. The Alnicos are much more suited for that kind of lower gain, clanky, kind of late 60s Marshall thing. And of course the greenbacks are just that classic rock sound. It just screams all of those classic records. And I think it worked equally well as with all of the guitars as well. My favourites were the SG because it's pure Angus, and the Gronland with the Filtertron because that's pure Malcolm. You can see where my influences lie, can't you? But I think this thing just sounds absolutely fantastic, and it really has kind of scratched the itch for sort of higher gain JMP, JCM-ish Marshall tone. It's its own thing because of course it's tube rectified, which those classic 50-watt Plexis never were. So it has a bit more kind of sponginess to it, but it just screams classic modern Marshall. I absolutely love this thing. But as always, folks, those are just my opinions, so please do let me know yours underneath. I love hearing from you folks on all this sort of stuff. So thank you for watching, folks. I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it makes a big, big difference when you hit subscribe. And I will see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.